everybody, I'm Sarah and I'm a recorder player. The difference between French, Italian and German Baroque music. Ooh, this is such an interesting subject and they have some really different cool characteristics. In the beginning, I was quite reticent to get into this subject because you can literally study a 4-year degree in it. How do I condense it down into one YouTube video? Grr. So I've selected snippets of information I find relevant and useful. Obviously, I've had to make some generalizations and miss a few things out. If there's something you're desperately thinking, why was that not mentioned? Please share it below. I've also teamed up with classical music streaming service PRIMEPHONIC, who are amazing, to bring you a playlist accompanying this video, so you don't only have to listen to me talking, you can actually go and listen to the music too. More on that later. Right, let's give some context, shall we? What is Baroque music? This is Western classical music roughly in the period 1600 to 1750. It ended in 1750 with the death of Bach, like a big curtain. It was mainly concentrated in Europe in 2 main schools, Italian and French. If you're playing Baroque music, it can be really useful to know what style your piece was composed in and how you can then interpret it. Obviously, there was a lot of crossover between the two that makes it even more fun, and then what was happening in Germany and then England and Let's start by looking at what French and Italian Baroque music had in common. So Baroque music, rather than Renaissance, which came before it, you were playing in a key, like D minor, G major, those are keys, rather than a mode. Generalization alert, harmony in Baroque music was starting to get more complex and they really loved dissonance. In both schools you had what was known as a basso continuo section, your accompaniment section. This was made up of a bass line played by instruments such as a bass viol or a viola da gamba or a cello, basically low stringed instruments, and then chords on top played by a harpsichord or a lute or a theorbo. They would actually improvise these chords from a figured bass, so the harmony was condensed into numbers. They would look at those numbers and know what to do and play chords on top. And in both French and Italian, you had your melody instruments on top. These were the recorder, the traverso flute, baroque oboe, your cornetto, which was like a bit like a recorder body with a trumpet mouthpiece, but also the violin. I obviously do not play the violin. In terms of musical forms, you saw them in both schools, dance movements, sonatas, orchestral pieces, operas, but they did favour different ones. And across all Baroque music, the role of a performer and a composer was much more blurred. You would write pieces, play them, play pieces, improvise them. Wait. I keep catching myself out on these like, oh, but I think that's what makes it fascinating. And I've wrote down a whole bunch of words that I feel describe Baroque music: expressive, dissonance, rich, full, communicative, complex, searching, contrast. That's what we're saying. So those are the things French and Italian Baroque music have in common. Come on, let's get to the differences. Oh, so before I talk about the music, let's tell you about the playlist that I've made for you. For this video, I have partnered with PRIMEPHONIC, who are a dedicated classical music streaming service. Not every streaming service is cut out for classical music. You end up getting 1,000 tracks just named Allegro and you can't tell what's what. PRIMEPHONIC is here to sort all of that out. It's designed for classical music, so it's really easy to search, find who you're looking for. And the really nice thing is that you can choose to listen to it in regular or exceptional high quality, giving that music the quality it deserves. If you're newer to classical music, they have helped you out with a whole bunch of helpful playlists, including mine. And one thing I want to say is that they're very fair to the artists. The artists themselves actually get paid per second of streaming, not per track. This is so important with classical music, where you can have a long orchestral track that's an hour and a half long. So I've created a playlist to accompany this video. It's called Team Recorder. It has 21 tracks full of gorgeous recorder music. To listen to the playlist, first sign up for PRIMEPHONIC at the link below. If you use my code that's written down there, you get the first 2 months completely free. And then when you've signed up, you can go and enjoy my playlist and then all the other amazing classical music they've got on there. We'll start with the big generalisation. For me, a huge difference was the general feel. French music tended to be more about elegance, grace. It was refined and restrained whilst being very grand. Whilst Italian music was extravagant, extrovert, virtuosic, passionate, and very catchy. Obviously, there's a huge historical and political context to go into. A couple of important things to know. In France, the music was hugely regulated. A lot of it was organised by Lully, who was a very important composer at the court of Louis XIV in Versailles. He had a monopoly on music and dance, basically. So it was contained within a small, elite, controlled world. Whereas in Italy, in 1637, you had your first public opera house open. The music was there to appeal to the masses. I think that's great. So you had the public going there, the tunes had to be catchy, the emotions had to be right there in your face, because it was the general public going to listen to this music, rather than the king. You had a lot of crossover between the two schools and composers who would borrow from both styles, but there was a lot of friction. One of the most important French composers, Marais, actually forbade his students to play Italian music. He was like, French. And what was happening in Germany? This was really a merging of the two schools, referred to as les goûts réunis, the good taste. Les Goûts Réunis is named after a collection of pieces by the French composer Couperin. He actually named a movement after the Italian Corelli and the French Lully, bringing together these worlds of French and Italian music. So that was the general atmosphere of the music. Let's look into some more specific differences. Instruments. I already mentioned a bunch of instruments that were common. There were some subtle differences. For example, French recorder writing tended to favour the voice flute or the flûte de voix. It's a tenor recorder in D. It comes very close to the human voice, and while it's very agile, it still has quite a dark, sombre sound, and this fit the French music very well. Whereas in Italian music, you tend to see higher, brighter instruments, the alto, and of course Vivaldi's concerti for the flautino, sopranino. In stringed music, the French tended to go for viols, while the Italians favoured the newer violins, violas, cellos. Viols were often played more as a family. They had more strings, most often 6. And were a bit more old-fashioned, can I say that? Whereas the newfangled violins, cellos, 4 strings. If we look at musical forms and settings, the two schools did tend to favour different ones. Looking at France, all of this music coming out of the royal courts, what the king loved was to be entertained. There were hundreds of courtiers who were trained in dance that would perform for him every day. That means a lot of dance music had to be composed. So in the French Baroque, you're seeing dance suites, ballets. These would often be combined with an instrumental prelude that acted as a little taster, warm-up into the dance music. Whereas in Italy, it was much more extravagant works that were there to wow your wider audience. We had more concertos, which was an orchestral piece with a solo instrument on top, impressing everyone with their virtuosity. And especially a concerto grosso, which is a concerto, but then with a whole group of soloists. Why have one soloist when you can have lots? These were present in Germany too, but there you also saw a great deal of religious music, cantatas, church works, often because composers would be employed by a church. That was what Bach was doing. That's why he wrote so many blooming cantatas. They were paying his rent. And I feel like the German Baroque, they were the great architects of music. So you also see a lot of fugues where a theme comes in and then it's decorated and turned around and comes back in another form, and it's all built in this like amazing cathedral of notes. And then again, the forms that were common to all of them: opera you saw a lot, and of course, what re-recorder players love, the sonata. So if you're interpreting Baroque music, how are we going to approach things like the feel, the tempo, the rhythm? generalization horn going off again. In French, the phrases tend to be shorter, slower. In Italian, the phrases were longer and faster. And I feel like in German Baroque, they were just very, very well structured. Like in the solo flute partita of Bach. That piece is pure architecture. So in the French, dum, pa-dum, pa-da-da-dum, pa-dum. And Italian, something very important to the French style was the use of inégal. This translates as unequal. Technically speaking, it's in a string of notes, changing the feel so that rather than giving the emphasis on the first and the third, you give it on the second and the fourth. Instead of ra 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 ta 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 ra ta ta, you have do 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 do. You would do this as a recorder player by using the articulation to do with the weak ru on the first and third beats and the strong tu on the second and fourth. How extreme you made it was according to your own personal taste. Where to put inégal, you use it on the fastest note values that you see in your piece. 8th notes or 16th notes. There are some exceptions. You wouldn't use it on repeated notes, on jumps or on slurs. A lot of rules, are you still with me? You can use inégal in other kinds of Baroque music, but it was really integral to the French style. Another thing that was very French is double dotting. Why just dot your notes when you can double dot? So if you see dotted notes written out, you would actually make it more extreme. Instead of dum, ba bum, ba bum, ba bum, that's more Italian, you'd have dum, ba dum, ba dum, pa dum, pa dum, pa dum. You basically have to imagine that you're a king, being very grand. I'm making this motion, and actually Lully used to conduct the orchestra by banging on the floor with a stick. He eventually banged on his own foot and died of septicemia. In my opinion, one of the most important differences between French and Italian Baroque music is their use of ornamentation. Ornamentation, putting embellishments onto your music, is absolutely integral to Baroque playing. But the French and the Italians approached it very differently. You had the passaggi, which were very long, elaborate, melodic ornamentations that completely covered the skeletal melody. And then you had graces, which were small, elegant ornaments, each tied to an individual note. Can you guess which was which? Yes, the long melodic passaggi were used in Italian music and the elegant graces were French. A huge difference was that in Italy, your ornaments would often be improvised. Almost no ornaments were written down. It was so inherent in the musical language, the performers would be expected to know what to do. Whereas at that time in French music, improvising your ornaments was actually forbidden. Composers such as Couperin, Hotteterre, D'Anglebert actually devised whole dictionaries of very specific symbols that the performers would be expected to follow to the letter. On my playlist, I put two really great examples of this. You have Dan Loren playing a largo from a Vivaldi concerto that he writes these, where he plays these beautiful long passaggi. And then you have Michele Petri playing the French La Rossignol à l'amour by Couperin, where you can really hear how it's these very individual, beautiful, elegant graces. And of course there were commonalities. You would always do a trill at the end of a phrase, a cadence. What in English we call a mordant, in French was called a battement. The Italian appoggiatura was the French pour de voix. The trill, or groppo in Italian, was the French tremblement. So in French, I'm going to do a pour de voix attached to a battement, attached to a tour de chant, and then a tremblement, and then a bit of flattement. Flattement, that is very French. Finger vibrato. basically used to give expression to any long note. Of course, the Italians had vibrato too. We definitely had the messa di voce, which was a vibrato that started small, grew, and went down again. Very much used in singing. By the way, the examples I just played are from a Baroque ornamentation tutor by Janos Bali. Amazing book. A really useful resource are the Telemann methodical sonatas. In each sonata he gives a slow movement in simple and then in ornamented form. This helps the performer to see how it's done, really understand it and get familiar with the musical language. I don't know how much you can read, but you can see these elaborate Italian style passaggi and then sometimes these little French grace notes, all mixed up together in Les Goûts Réunis. Oh, Telemann! Telemann's a nice one. He also explored these different styles in his Fantasias, known to all recorder players. Number one, I feel, is really Italian. And number 7 is your classic French overture, beginning with a very grand opening and then going into a compound triple time dance section. So we've gotten this far and I've not mentioned English Baroque. England was a centre of Baroque music at the time as well. In general, it was definitely more Italian than French, but I feel that English Baroque had its own special something. They loved weird harmonies, and I feel like this was a bit of a hangover from the extreme melancholy of John Dowland. In the playlist, I've put a very famous piece by Purcell from Dido and Aeneas that has this amazing descending chromatic bass line. Da, 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 da. And there is a piece by Matthew Locke. The harmony is gonna blow your mind. I've never sounded less cool, but I do not care. In my playlist, I tried to give you a French, an Italian, and a German example of all different forms. We've got orchestral music, opera, dance movements, ornamentation, recorder sonatas, and a bit of England thrown in for good measure. So don't forget, you can get 2 free months of PRIMEPHONIC by signing up with my code, and then you can go listen to the playlist. So that was it. As always, you can subscribe to my channel by clicking on my face down here. Down here is the Team Recorder Patreon, where you can choose to support the channel, and up here is my video on the Telemann Fantasias. Thanks for watching and have a great day. Bye!